Good evening. I'm Patrick Lewis, Director of Collections and Research at the Filson. I'm so glad that you joined us both in person and virtually for our Dine and Dialogue lecture. And thank you again for joining us for Life Behind the Veil. Dr. George C. Wright is Professor, Senior Advisor to the President and Vice President for Institutional Diversity at the University of Kentucky. Prior to this, he was the 7th President of Prairie View A&M University, the second oldest public institution of higher education in Texas. Dr. Wright has held positions at many prestigious academic institutions, including Duke University, University of Texas at Austin, and the University of Texas at Arlington. He has been the recipient of numerous fellowships, grants, and awards during his tenure, and he is the author of 3 books, which include A History of Blacks in Kentucky, Volume 2, In Pursuit of Equality, 1890 to 1980, Racial Violence in Kentucky, 1865 to 1940, Lynchings, Mob Rule, and Legal Lynchings, and Life Behind a Veil, Blacks in Louisville, Kentucky, 1865 to 1930, along with several articles, chapters, and essays. I'll return to moderate questions after the presentation as time permits. If you have a question, come to the microphones at either side of the room, or if you're joining us virtually, drop them in the chat and we'll make sure they get asked. Please join me in welcoming Dr. George Wright.
Good evening. It is indeed a pleasure to be here, and I need to remember that this is also being Zoomed, and I was told that I have to stand right here. So I'll try to remember to not wander as I speak around the room. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that my lifelong partner, friend, and wife is here with me tonight, Valerie Ellison Wright. This time last week, we celebrated our 52nd wedding anniversary. So we're very pleased with that. I was trying to count the number of occasions that I've given presentations here in Louisville. I've actually lost count. I think I gave my first presentation somewhere in Louisville in the 1970s, and I probably came to the Filson Historical sometime in the 1980s. 3 years ago, when I came back to the University of Kentucky, I was invited back here to speak. And at that time, I talked about how my scholarship and my life go together. And I was going to write an autobiographical account about my life and about travels that Valerie and I have done to a number of places in the world as we try to understand race relations from a number of different perspectives. Tonight, I'm going back to one of my oldest presentations, and that is to talk about Life Behind the Veil, Blacks in Louisville, Kentucky, a book that was published in 1985. That book and my other 2 books on race relations in Kentucky have had something of a resurgence over the last few years, in part because of the tragedies that have happened. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and things like that have led to renewed interest. But also at the same time, a lawyer by the name of Brian Stevenson with the Equal Justice Initiative, where he's cataloged the number of lynchings at his place in Montgomery, Alabama. He actually has monuments to 8 of the lynchings that I mentioned in Kentucky, as well as hundreds of other lynchings. And so his work has led to a resurgence of interest in the work that I am doing. My book, Life Behind the Veil, Blacks in Louisville, Kentucky, covers the period 1865 to the Great Depression, but there were events that happened in the period 1930 to the 1980s that led to my wanting to write that book. I grew up in Lexington, but I had always come to Louisville for the state tournament back then. Plus, I had dozens of relatives here in Louisville. But one of the scholarly things that interest me was Louisville received a great deal of attention in the 1950s, or 56, 57, 58, for its peaceful desegregation of its public schools, that they made national attention for that. Well, shortly thereafter, 1958, 1959, Louisville was in the news again, this time when a white couple, Ann and Carl Braden, purchased a home for a Black couple in the suburb of Shively. And that home was bombed. And instead of arresting the people responsible for that, the focus of the investigation was on Ann and Carl Braden, who were eventually arrested for sedition in that regard. Louisville received national attention for that. Martin Luther King Jr.'s brother was a pastor here of a church in Louisville, but Louisville, being a border city, also was a good place for King's movement to come to. In the late 1950s through about 63, 64, Martin Luther King made any number of trips here to Louisville, and it was a protracted and long struggle to desegregate Louisville back then. That made national news. And when my wife completed her degree at the University of Kentucky in 1972, she's hired here in Louisville as a reporter for the Louisville Times. And back then, during that time period, Charlotte, North Carolina, Boston, Massachusetts, and Louisville, Kentucky were three places receiving attention for resistance to school busing. So some of those events led to my being interested in Louisville. And as a historian, instead of wanting to concentrate in that time period, I was more interested in saying, given these, what had Louisville always been like? Was Louisville a progressive city, or was Louisville like Birmingham, the nickname that some people were calling Birmingham at this time period? Recall, Louisville had a bombing and a number of other cities did. So was Louisville like Birmingham, Alabama? My wife's a journalist. I'll make sure I say it correctly. Birmingham, Alabama. Or was Louisville somehow different? Was Louisville a progressive place or not? And so I decided to do my scholarship, my dissertation at Duke University, and then I expanded that into a larger study. I spent a great deal of time contemplating exactly what should be the title. What would be the hook? How would I somehow talk about Louisville? And I came up actually from an interview with a person who had lived in Louisville, but was a professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Blyden Jackson. And he talked about living in Louisville for people like him had been as if they had existed behind a veil. So I took that from Blyden Jackson, life behind a veil. And to me, it meant that they could see the world of white people. And in some ways, their world was similar to that of white people. But in many ways, the world that they lived in was rather foggy compared to that of white people. And so I decided to use life behind a veil as something that would carry me throughout. In doing so, I had two major themes that I wanted to talk about throughout that study and to really decide, where does Louisville rest? Is Louisville like northern cities, or is it like Richmond, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, some other cities that were closer to the border? Or was Louisville more like some southern cities in that regard? The first theme was that I wanted to look at Black life in Louisville. What was the existence of Black people like? And in doing so, I went back to 1865 when the people had been freed. First of all, Blacks had been freed in Kentucky, a state that had remained loyal, and it meant that whites in Kentucky, whether they had been Union supporters or Confederate supporters, were freer to handle what they called the quote unquote Negro problem, unquote, than were whites further south. For an example, you all know that Kentucky, because it was not under the same edicts as the ex-Confederate states, voted against the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. When I'm a young person, Kentucky's legislature decided to open this again, and they passed these in the 1970s. But guess what? Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Texas, all of them were compelled to do that back in the 1860s and 70s. It meant that whatever Black people decided to do in Kentucky after the Civil War, it would probably be with some white resistance. Or think about this. After World War II, what did the United States do to Germany, its ex-enemy? It gave aid to Germany. When I first went to Germany in 1985, I was astonished by the appreciation, by the love so many Germans had of America. Then you go back and see all the things that the United States did for Germany in the late 40s up through the mid 1950s, especially when Russia put an embargo over Berlin in that regard. That was not the case with the ex-slaves. They were given at best the clothes on their back. Yet somehow in Louisville, in Kentucky, and in the South, these folk uplifted themselves. They started churches, they started schools, to be sure. Some Northerners, missionary folk helped with some of these schools, but they started mutual aid societies, fraternities and sororities that would benefit them. And they also started organizations that would bring a sense of fulfillment and enjoyment in their lives. Many of these organizations would exist all the way down to the present, but they did more. They started businesses. They accumulated property and things like that. Jump ahead, the Black community here in Louisville by 1920 had 2 Black banks, several insurance companies, newspapers, a college, 2 public libraries. To be sure, Andrew Carnegie had helped with that, but he only put those libraries in places where there were thriving Black communities. By the 1920s, before the Great Depression, Louisville's Black community was literally a city within a city. As I look around these rooms, and I will admit I've had a number of eye surgeries, but when I look out there, all of you look younger than me, right? I'm a baby boomer born in 1950. Well, anyone Black born when I was, if we have been successful at all, it is because we spent our formative years in the Black community and benefited from the things there. I recall, and anything Lexington had, you know, Louisville had it and more, being made to go to Black History Month programs. So, you know, from the time I was that little growing up, I had to learn poems. I had to say speeches. I had to do all sorts of things in school for Negro History Month, as well as other things. The Black community educated us in so many ways. And so, in other words, the Black community that I talk about as one of my themes set the foundation for the life of Black people even down to the present. That's theme number 1 in my book, on life behind the veil. And of course, one of the times I will never forget when I came here to Louisville, I talked about some of the social clubs and things like that. And guess what I did? I mentioned a few names, which meant I neglected other folks' names. You wouldn't believe how folk jumped. Please don't you all jump on me like this during the question. Those folk laid me, don't you know so-and-so? And I thought you were a historian. If you really knew stuff, you know about my mother and my father, I was told. And they were correct. There were all sorts of people who made contributions in the African-American community here. Theme number 2 is on race relations and the struggle by Blacks for equality. That I looked at race relations in Louisville. Here's what I discovered, that in most respects, Louisville resembled other southern cities, and Louisville and Kentucky prided itself on being quote unquote Southern. Again, some of you may know that some scholars have even said that Kentucky waited till after the Civil War to succeed. Well, nevertheless, it had a Southern attitude, and this carried over in race relations, and that the segregation that existed further south existed here. But guess what my work also showed? That, if you can believe this, if you say segregation, that in many places there was a total racial exclusion. It's one thing to be segregated to a Negro park. It's another thing to be excluded from all parks. That Blacks in Louisville were segregated, were denied interest into white facilities, but they often had facilities of their own, which is different than Birmingham and many other places. And guess what? My work goes a little bit further, and it said, you know what? In some ways, race relations seem to be better. And I trotted out the word maybe even milder in Louisville than in other places, and that Louisville and my hometown of Lexington both had a, quote, polite form of racism. That's something I threw out. Now, think about this. On the surface, you would say, if racism exists, do you want the most brutal, ugly form of racism? I wrote a book on racial violence in Kentucky, that if I were to catalog to you all of the lynchings that happened in Kentucky and the burning at the stakes, you'll either say I'm exaggerating or I'm trying to gross you out. That's what you would say. All right. But, okay, so that's the more brutal side, but what about the polite form? Well, as I show that the polite form meant the absence by and large of the over brutal form, but it rested on Black people willingly accepting their place at the bottom of society. And if by chance in Louisville, they ever decide that they were going to be more assertive, guess what then happened? Wright showed them that they could put polite racism aside and use the same brutal forms of racism that existed further south. I end by saying, you know what's fascinating, if you would, or horrifying, that Birmingham, with its ugly, brutal racism, might have had to confront it more than Louisville's polite racism, and that maybe in a strange way, more progress occurs under the more brutal form. Isn't that something? Isn't that interesting? That you would think you want brutal, you want milder over brutal. Contributing to Louisville's more moderate form were some leading spokespersons who demanded that Louisville not act brutal in the same way as further south. Former Confederate General John Castleman was a person who advocated for Blacks being given parks, recreational things, and treated with respect, though in a segregated environment. A man named John Little ran 2 settlement houses here in Louisville and devoted his life to uplifting Black people, but always in a segregated environment. And make no mistake about it, Castleman and Little and the other moderates on race, who you must realize were different than the Negrophobes of that period. The Negrophobes were the ones who were involved in race baiting that led to the lynchings of Black people. You do know that between 1880 and 1930, on average, a Black person was lynched somewhere in America every other day. That's the work of the Negrophobes and the race baiters, not the moderates. But the moderates kept a lid on it. In preparing for tonight's presentation, I really thought, how do I talk about the moderates in such a way as to really make the point about them with you, the Filson Historical Group and guests? Because the moderates were not mean-spirited people overall, that they were not hateful people, but try as I cannot come up with another word other than to call those folks were racists who believed that Black people were different and did not deserve to be treated with the same respect as white people. Here's what all you have to do is read the Louisville newspapers, the Lexington newspapers, or anywhere, and you'll see moderates, when they're not even talking about Black people, when there's nothing to do with race, they make jokes about Black people. They refer to Black people in derogatory terms. They could be having a party for the Derby. Nobody Black is there except as servants, and they will call some activities the darky dance. Why didn't they just call it a dance? These moderates, when they came to having names for stubborn or what they called stubborn or stupid animals. I'm not so sure any animal is stubborn or stupid, but when they said they were, they called them the N-word in that regard. They didn't call them white animals. They called them something else. So moderates, at the very least, succumb to the racism of their day. Okay? So that's the second theme of my book on life behind the veil. I will close by raising, every once in a while, since I am a history professor, one of the things I loved about being a student is that my professors did not give me the answers, or when they gave me the answers, I typically didn't agree with them anyway. So I want to raise several questions for folk to think about. And that is, I started by asking, was Louisville progressive? So if we look at Louisville, let's say 1975 to the present, or you pick the time period, but come down to the present. Is Louisville progressive? Is Louisville better? Has Louisville made real progress, or what? One of the issues is, for me, when I came back here in 2019, actually several months before I came back here, I was called by several people up here and they asked me to weigh in on the whole John Castleman statue. I was asked to weigh in on that. And guess what I did? I disappointed both sides of folk on that issue. Oh my goodness, I did. But ultimately, the John Castleman statue came down. So here's my question to you. Would that have happened in 1950? I don't think it would have. Would it have happened in 1970? Would it have happened 25 years ago? I don't think it would. Does it mean that Louisville is really progressive? Some people tell me yes, Louisville is really progressive. I argue to them, not to the degree that you may think it is, but far more than many people who say it has not changed at all. You see, that I know many white people who said that racial inequality no longer exists. I said, not true. Racial progress has been made. I know some Black folk who say nothing has changed, and they point to certain things, and I say not true on that as well. But I think the Castleman statue is a very, very interesting one. What does the whole Breonna Taylor case tell us about Louisville? Again, I've read a lot about that, and about a year ago, my wife is so tired of hearing me say this. I'm at home minding my own business, right? That's all I'm doing. I'm not bothering anybody. I get a call from, it said, this is the office of the Attorney General of the state of Kentucky. And I said, oh my goodness, what have I done? I remember when I was in the 9th grade, I did this. They done caught up with me now. Lord, I about confessed to something I did in 1959 because the Attorney General of Kentucky is calling me. They said, we want you to serve on the search warrant task force to make some recommendations. I served on that committee. I don't know if I pleased anybody. You know, everything I do, nobody is pleased with. The folk who told me they really love me at the end, they always say, you know, I'm just not impressed. The other folk, I don't know if I can win them over, but in trying to look at search warrants, we're trying to see certain things. We, a committee of 25 people or something like that, we were involved in that. What does the whole Breonna Taylor case tell you? And what about Emily Bingham's new book on my old Kentucky home and the response of Churchill Downs? Okay, disclosure. I know Emily Bingham, she's a fellow historian. She has a degree, I apologize, from an inferior institution in North Carolina called University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. My degree is from Duke. Now, you do know UNC is not hardly inferior to Duke, right? They are like this. If you, like me, when you go to graduate school with Duke, you spend a lot of time at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, one of the very best places. And so I know Emily Bingham. I am an admirer of hers. She and I debated the Castleman issue. We talked about things and so forth. And so I've read her book and that kind of thing. Well, the day of the Derby, Mike Tirico, the NBC analyst, made a statement before the race was about to start. I can't say it verbatim, but he said something to the effect, we're about to have two traditions, the call to post and the playing of my old Kentucky home. He said on Thursday, this is Saturday, he had a conversation with Bill Parstangenson. I apologize, Mr. Bill, for messing it up if I did. And he said he asked him about the controversy. He replied on behalf of the Churchill Downs officials that they had deliberated long about this issue, and they had heard from people on all sides, and their fans wanted it played, and they would do that. Okay. And then he said, after this, we'll have the call to the post by Steve Buttleman. There was a time when I first came here to Louisville and to the Filson Historical to speak, when I would have simply said the Churchill Downs response was plain old racism 101. Now I say, wonder why people can't be sensitive to the concerns of other people. That folk they can't put themselves in other people's places. I mentioned earlier in my presentation that one of the things that happened to me from this age on up was that I had to attend Negro and eventually Black History Month programs. At every one of those programs, we sung the Negro National Anthem. In fact, every time I'm in a program today and they sing it, I look around and I'm mad that everybody doesn't know the song, all 4 verses like I do. I'm wondering what's going on with them. Do you know if somebody brought the same amount of evidence to me that Emily Bingham put forward about the Negro National Anthem, I would never, ever, double negative on purpose, sing it again. And I would work to make sure no one else sung it again as well, because I would be concerned about the feelings of others in that regard. I'll close by saying that I have no doubt that Churchill Downs has made progress over the years. I have no doubt that I bet you they have Black people and women and all sorts of folk. Somebody's laughing. I'm not saying, I'm giving folk the benefit of the doubt. I don't live in Louisville. I'm assuming that they, like everybody else, has made progress over the years. But I believe that Churchill Downs, Louisville, Lexington, America still has a way to go. But significant progress has been made in my life, and it can still be done. But the problem with Churchill Downs, with Louisville, with America, is that we set such a low bar when it comes to race that what looks like progress to me is not real change at the end of the day. I thank you for your time. Okay.
So much, Dr. Wright, for those remarks.
Okay.
If anyone does have questions, we have 2 mics on either side of the room. I would ask that you come up here if you can to answer or ask your questions so that everybody can hear, especially those folks who are joining us online. Please feel free.
Right. And if a question is asked, there are a number of experts here in the audience. You all feel free to respond as well.
Help me understand your objections to the Black National Anthem, or did I misunderstand you?
My objection to what?
I thought I heard you saying that you now would never sing.
No. I said, if it were pointed out to me that something that matters a lot to me was offensive to other people, I'm okay with no longer doing that. I would not partake of that anymore. Do understand, I come from Texas. I've spent a lot of time in Texas. That university, which will always be indebted to, they have a song called The Eyes of Texas. And that has been pointed out. And once again, people have said, but we're in favor of that. Now, you do know the old George Wright would have said to Churchill Downs and to those other folk, why don't you vote and why don't you ask them and do a vote on some other things like, should we bring back public lynchings and see what our fan base says to that? Then what would we do in that regard? At what point do you allow, just because somebody likes something, to carry the day versus something that's right to be done? No, there's nothing wrong. No, please don't say that. I won't be giving a presentation for Black History Month if folk heard me say that. So no, there's nothing wrong. I said, if there was something wrong with it, I wouldn't do it. No more than I can understand it's somebody who says they like the singing of My Old Kentucky Home and saying, but yes, we understand that it did put Black folk down, but I like it nevertheless.
Thank you for your talk. Being born in 1940 and living in Louisville all my life, I've watched through things when you talk about like Churchill Downs. I worked at Churchill Downs when I was going to college. The only Black person you saw was maybe the waiters. Today, that's totally out
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
Also in Louisville, you're absolutely right about having a central high school
Mhm.
as the Black high school. And it was always thought that they had a nice gym.
Mhm.
They had some real nice stuff there.
Mhm.
Uh, I went to a school where we were the first school to play Central uh, back in 1957, 58, something like that. Uh, Anyway, so I guess my question was on Louisville. I've always been kind of proud of Louisville. Uh, I know we have a race problem, but we take care of it. I mean, we really progressed from what I've saw back years ago. Uh, and you came from Lexington, apparently grew up in Lexington. In my knowing of Lexington, the times I were there, they were much more racist than Louisville,
Mhm.
you know.
Yeah.
And then once you get outside of Louisville,
Mhm.
the racism is there. I mean, we just took, you talked about Castleman.
Mhm.
I mean, we just, within the last year or two, the Governor Bashir took down Jefferson Davis
Mhm.
out of the Capitol.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, you would have thought that that thing would have came out years ago,
Mhm. Mhm.
but you're absolutely right. And
Mhm.
I think your book like yours is very needed,
Mhm.
because my whole family would have been from 1850s in Louisville all the way up to
Mhm.
through that point you were talking about.
Right.
But I thank you very much.
Don't leave. Let me point this out. I didn't go into to many details in the book, but on the cover of my book is Central High School. And Central High School would be one of the first colored high schools in the country. That there would be a lot of cities a lot larger than Louisville where Black education stops at the 8th grade. And Louisville had that. So here's the irony, as the gentleman just pointed out, that in a lot of ways, Louisville was in that context progressive, that Louisville was ahead. And having grown up in Lexington, I cannot dispute what the gentleman just said about Lexington probably being less progressive, though it had a polite form, I would argue, as well. But it still was not equal, as the gentleman said. But notice what else he said. Churchill Downs has even changed. You see, things have changed, yet we still have you know what the gentleman just made me think of, and I didn't have it in my remarks tonight. You know what Martin Luther King said in the mid-1960s? He said the most troublesome adversary is not the ardent George Wallace's, the segregationists and the race haters, but the whites who are more devoted to order than to justice, who tell folk to wait on their equal rights. You see, that's what Martin Luther King said a long time ago, that Louisville's more devoted to order than to equality. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for being here. I'm just so delighted to be here. I chose the right day because you mentioned Central High School.
Mhm.
So do you have the booklet about the Central High School? I think it's from 18 something to 1980s.
I do not have that.
Oh, you know, okay. Well, did you know that in 1935, Central class of 35, their theme was the contribution of the Negro
Mhm.
to American life.
Mhm.
That's when my mother graduated. She was part of that. And if you haven't met any of the teenagers who shook the hand of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and were jailed in 1961, you have now.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
so I'm just thrilled that you're here because you mentioned Dr. King. You lived in Lexington.
Mm.
And I don't know if you lived there in 1964.
I did.
Well, did you join us when we marched,
Okay.
even with Dr. King and Jackie Robinson?
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Interestingly, don't leave, don't leave. There is a picture in the University of Kentucky Library
Uh-huh.
of that march there. But let me just say something that I have said a lot of times, and you really bring life to it. I was born in 1950, so it meant when the March on Washington occurred, I'm 13 years old. I never participated in a march or a demonstration. Are you hearing me?
Oh.
Martin Luther King is assassinated April the 4th,
Oh.
1968. His assassination leads to me, my wife, future wife, would have gone to college anyway, but I would not have gone to college had it not been for his death and the program. And so here's what I tell folks. I was an observer of the civil rights movement, not a participant. If the world had truly been fair, the people who were spit upon, who did all the other things, would have gotten the scholarships and the opportunities that I've had. You see, I go to college in 1968, having done nothing in high school. I joke and tell folks the reason I did so well in college was that I had a brain that had never been used. You know, that makes no sense. You know, that doesn't make sense. Okay. But 9 years later, I have a PhD from Duke, and the world opened, and the world is still opening opportunities to me because of the sacrifices of other people. It's people like you who made it possible for me. Again, I'm at the Filson Historical. I hope I won't get in trouble for quoting a scripture here. If I do, I apologize. This will be my last time at the Filson. I got it. Okay. John, the 4th chapter, 36, 37 says, "'Tis true that some sow and others reap. I sent you, George Wright, to reap where you did not sow. You did the work, and I got the harvest." Do you all understand that? That other people made it possible for people to have opportunities. Now, what does that say to us? What are we doing to make sure other people have opportunities? I thank you so much for having said that. And I'm serious when I say, I try to say things in a humorous fashion, but all my life I've admired the folk who were bold enough to take part in demonstrations. You know what? I'm a freshman at the University of Kentucky. I'm scared to death, right? I hadn't done anything in high school. I'm at a football game. The black students say, "You better not stand up when they play my old Kentucky home." But I'm 18, I'm scared. White folks looking at us menacing. You know what George Wright did? I went to the bathroom when they played. Gee, horrible, right? That's what I did.
Well, thank you for mentioning about Lexington, Kentucky, having that article, that newspaper clippings that came from not just the Kerr Journal, but the Louisville Times.
Yes, ma'am.
I donated my own
Okay.
original to the Filson Historical
Okay.
Society.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much.
I just had a question. Oh, is it okay? So, my question is, in light of all of that and kind of related to this, can you talk a little bit about how polite or genteel racism's effect on quelling or staunching in any way, any protest movements in Louisville? Obviously, in 1968, you just mentioned that date. It was called a riot. Of course, now a lot of the terminology has been revamped. So now uprising, I guess, would be more appropriate. But with just your scholarship, how do you feel, or how do you what have you seen in the scholarship that relates to how the politeness of everything has just kind of quelled our protest movement?
Here's the problem with the politeness, and I'm not here to advocate that folk ought to be overturning destroying property or doing anything like that. A lot of times, the polite racism could lull both sides into thinking that's the best that can be done, that they should not push even harder for change. Again, as Martin Luther King pointed out with order and justice, politeness can make white people think that this incremental giving of things is okay, but they didn't incrementally receive their rights. But they can say to you, it's okay for you to incrementally receive your rights. So it's easier for all of us maybe to buy into it. And so that's the challenge that we face. You do face the problem of when you are louder, or in some ways, folk have a tendency to look at you and not the issue. In that sense. But just because you're loud does not mean your issue isn't a right one in that regard. So what I would say is that you have to find the right way to be engaged in bringing about change. I personally believe, I think education, having certain kinds of opportunities to then have you be in the room when decisions are made is one way that helps make decisions change over time in that regard. But I think people have got to be engaged some way or the other to bring about changes.
There was a very good documentary made, I think back in the 1930s. I think they hadn't been here at the Pilsen about it one time, and it referred to Louisville as the city of leave well enough alone.
Let's say that again, the city what?
The city of leave well enough alone. So I think the reputation goes way, way back about racism. Two questions I want to ask you is, without stepping on anybody's toes or making anybody mad because they got left out, who would you identify as the religious leaders of the 20th century, black or white, that helped lift the veil a little bit in Louisville? And my second question is, who would you identify in the media community, be they Frank Stanley or be they somebody in the Bingham family, who also did the same thing to help kind of mediate things a little bit?
Okay. Wow. I'm not going to be able to satisfy you with that. I wrote an article years ago on the desegregation movement in Louisville, and I have a hard time just identifying, let's say, several Black church leaders as opposed to a group of church leaders working over time, as opposed to, let's say, well, Dr. Martin Luther King, whenever he came to a place, he brought a certain kind of attention to it, but he was successful only in places where there was already a groundwork underway and where other people had been successful, and that would be the same here. There were people in Louisville going back to the 20s, 30s, and 40s. You mentioned newspaper editors. Even before Frank Stanley, there had been William Worley and I. Willis Cole, and then I'll miss somebody else's name who had been involved. There was even an educator here, a man named Albert Ernest Mazik, who was fortunate enough to live to be 101 years old, and he protested literally 80 years in Louisville in that regard. So there were a number of people. There were also, you mentioned the Binghams and so forth, that again, make no mistake about it, there were sincere white people in Louisville who, again, some of those were religious folk, and others who were involved. That again, the civil rights movement is not just a Black movement. It is a movement that cuts across racial and class lines when it was in fact successful. But I'm not going to be able to say point blank in my mind, these this was the black leader in Louisville, and this was the white person, somebody else, especially since their scholarship may come down even more to the present, might be able to answer that better than I can. You also mentioned your first comment about what kind of city Louisville was. Interestingly enough, in those same years, Atlanta had the slogan, "A city too busy to hate," was one. Dallas, Texas had one that said something like that as well. But in Atlanta, in Dallas, in Louisville, the establishment tried to control the movement. They gave enticements, and again, enticements are better than total rejection, but those enticements were not equality either.
And with a nod to the previous questioner, you left out Lyman Johnson, who was one of the all-time great Central High
Right.
teachers and a pretty big player on the civil rights scene here in Louisville.
Yeah.
Even in my time.
Yeah.
And I'm a little younger than that.
And I mentioned him prominently in my book, even though his main time period is after the 1930s. He was so knowledgeable about Louisville's past that he helped me a lot in helping to put things into a certain context.
And I believe he's a fellow UK alumni.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. Exactly right.
Oh, gosh, where do we start? Like you, I was an observer coming up because my grandparents were Republicans. They were Republicans, so being Republicans and being polite, we got a whole lot of perks. My grandmother bought a house in 1922 and actually got a mortgage from a institution to buy this house, $18 a month. So being Republicans and being in that politeness, we got to see a lot of things. So in 1968, boy, you need to be home. And because in that time, when grandfather said, boy, you need to do whatever, it was whatever. It was no questioning. So we had a lot of perks and we got to see a lot of things and we got to do a lot of things. But I was always just questioning, well, how, why is this? It was, I remember sitting and watching Gene Snyder and Sneed, who were the power brokers in the city of Louisville, sitting in my living room, strategizing with my grandfather about how he was going to get the black vote to vote for the Republicans. And like you, some he made happy, some he made mad. I always knew when it was political season because this was the tug of war that was going to happen between my grandfather and his friends. And, so it was always that politeness. So, and I guess what I want to know is, why is it that when we want to make changes, we always have to be polite?
Well, yeah, okay. Well,
When all we are receiving is rudeness.
okay.
So that's one of my statements. I want you, and then I have another one. I'm gonna
Okay.
follow up on that. So
Okay.
so how do you explain that?
Okay. Okay. Well, one of the challenges that Black people, or if you will, a minority group, not just Black people, but anyone who is a minority, is that the power structure is controlled by others. And so one of the things, if we talked about from the moment that whites encountered Africans in Africa coming forward, was that whites had more ammunition, power, and so forth. That in other words, blacks using violence, whites can resort with even greater violence. So violence is not really the main option. Making allies, appealing to one of the things, if you look at the Black struggle at any period in this country, and if you say John or Jane was radical, at some point, I bet they appealed to the United States Constitution or the laws of the country, that they've challenged whites to adhere to their own laws in that regard. So adhering to those kinds of, or believing in those kinds of things are it. But again, a Black person resorting to violence faces the risk of being engaged in the criminal justice system, the unfairness of that. So that's a primary reason for that. But Martin Luther King, Thurgood Marshall, and my hero, Nelson Mandela, have also said, once you have won, you then have got to sit down and work with the person who was your enemy. You know, one of the fascinating things is that you should have a legal scholar come and talk to you and to remind you of the Brown decision, May 17th, 1954. Okay.
Yes.
What does the Supreme Court ultimately say in saying that separate but equal is unconstitutional? They said that school integration and integrating other areas of American society would be such a monumental change that the victors and the losers need to go and think about it for a year and come back. And they came back and the court rendered Brown 2. We live under Brown 2, not Brown 1. Brown 2, May 31st, 1955, said what? With all deliberate speed. All deliberate speed meant one thing in Louisville. All deliberate speed meant in many places it never happened. But it also, Thurgood Marshall said, this is a tremendous setback because I now have got to negotiate with the very people who have fought me for over 30 years. You see, that's what had to happen. What did Nelson Mandela do? When he became president, did he do a bloodbath? Instead, they had reconciliation hearings. That they say we have to find a way to forgive in that sense. And so that may be what powerless people, but maybe it also should appeal to us morally to somehow sit down with our supposed enemy in that regard. So that's my response to that. And I apologize if that's not.
That's all right. That's all right. The only thing within that I think you took out of context for me personally,
Okay.
it's never been about violence for me.
Mm-hmm.
Never.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't, I mean, as you mentioned, we outgunned. So, guns and violence never can come into play. We got to have open negotiations
Mm-hmm.
so that you get what you want, I get what I want, and everybody walks away happy. Okay, now, my second point is something that just keeps coming up, and it's not going to go away until we find a way to address it. And that's that song. Now, Emily wrote a great book. Emily wrote, and she came here and made a great presentation. You can go look at it on YouTube anytime you get ready. But the question still remains, come Derby 2023, are we gonna sing that song? And at Emily's presentation, there were so many white people in this room that said, I ain't gonna never sing that song again. I don't ever want to hear that song again. Okay, so 2023, when UK does their whatever they do, what are we gonna do with that song? Because we all know what it means. We all know what it stands for. My question is, and then another question to the Filson Club, because the Filson Club presented Emily, what is the Filson Club going to do? So, you know, that's my question is, what are we going to do about that song? And I'm going to have a seat
Okay, okay.
and I'm going to,
Okay.
yes. So what are we going to do?
Okay, this may not be an answer, but I did not have in my presentation tonight, I actually, something that I believe, and that is for me personally, I cannot speak for women. I cannot speak for anyone who considers themselves to be a minority, but I've often said, perhaps the best thing about me being a minority is that I've had to look at the world through the eyes of other people and try to look at it from their perspective. And I think one of the things that developed in me long before it became fashionable to accept all of these other groups of folk was something that the empathy. That you see, I grew up in a world that Black people said to me, do not be gay. You can be a murderer, you can be a this, you can do anything, but don't be gay. I could not understand that. And I never, ever said anything negative about someone who we actually perceived to be gay. I don't know if those individuals were gay or not. But it also meant to me, when I was at Duke University, I used to go and play basketball on Friday, just in pickup games in the gym, no big deal. Duke would allow Durham local Blacks to come into the gym and play. They're not Duke students. They haven't paid Duke tuition. There were instances of when there would be 9 of us Blacks and 1 white guy, and I saw them pick and say inappropriate things to him. Now, trust me, I have never won a fight in my life, but I'll be doggone if I wasn't at the Filson, I'd use another word. I would not allow them to do that to that white person, right? Because I know what it's like. Do you all know if we go over here to this dinner tonight and they say X people can't come in, then George Wright's not going to eat there. You see, it's clear with me. My first year in Texas, I was asked to evaluate a program for the Texas Humanities Council, and it was held in a place called Jefferson, Texas, and they had a Confederate flag as big as this room in the dining hall. I wouldn't eat there, and I couldn't understand why other people could not eat there. If they had a flag that was anti-women, anti-gay, anti-anybody, George Wright would not have eaten there. You see, I don't have to be a member of a group to understand that something can cause them pain. So I'm real clear about my old Kentucky home, not to mention the documentation with that, but with a lot of other things as well. Empathy is what I think being Black has been one of the best things for me. And they're good. Now, I'll go ahead and say this, and you all can run me out. I've told women for years, you know, I'm as much a woman as you all are. They look at me like, what's he talking about? What the brother talking about? He can't have babies. But I know what it's like for women to be discriminated against. I know what it's like for people to stereotype women and to say all those ridiculous things about women in that regard. In this corner, I have never used the term since I've known this manpower. Whenever somebody says to me, you know, we need more manpower, I always say we got it made then because we got a lot of human power out there. I'm not going manpower. What the heck does that mean? Empathy is what we have to have.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to end on. Thank you so much, Dr. Wright. Can we have another hand?